I just don't think anybody would be interested in that. You know, and I mean, this was not a joke though. This was the serious comment we got, and basically they would say, now, you know, there's this Maranatha company, and they do an album every year called Praise. There's Praise 1 and Praise 2. And, you know, with one Praise album a year, I can't imagine that we would, as a bookstore, that we would want any more than that.
Little did they know.
And so we went back and said, well, okay, God, fine. You know, we'll just do our little every 8-week thing. And, you know, right about that time, I mean, God just absolutely exploded that program. Like, it was more than doubling every album. And it got to a point where, I mean, this was just staggering at the time, but every album I produced was going out to 250,000 people every 8 weeks on one day.
Wow.
Which, like, you know, so it was halfway to gold in a day, which for a Christian album at that point was just like unheard of. And it was at that point that the stores sort of came back to us, and then, you know, and then on top of the regular mail order thing, then the stores started to take it. So, but it was just so cool that there was no whiteboard, there was no business plan, there was no nothing. I mean, nobody had any idea that God was going to do this. It was a completely God-birthed thing.
Why do you think the mail order tape program was such a success, that form?
I mean, the one thing that I love about what Mike did is it was never a hard sell thing. I mean, everybody said he was crazy because what he did is he sent the tapes out on an approval basis. So basically, if you didn't like it, you just sent it back and you didn't pay for it. So it was such a low-key kind of approach that everybody said, sure, I'll try it. I don't even have to pay for it. So a lot of people tried it. So I really felt like, I mean, I'm not a sales guy, you know, but I love the idea of at least people are willing to listen to what we're doing. And if it blesses them, I think at the time, I don't know, it was like $7 or something, you know, that they would pay for it. And I really love that because it really let the worship speak for itself. And I mean, I think that's why it took off. You know, it was very, you know, very no risk. It was, you know, people had the opportunity to check it out, and I think, you know, God just touched people through it.
What challenges came along with the mail order program, and how long did it actually last, Tom?
Well, that's a great question. I think, I'm not sure that in some form, now obviously there was a point where it peaked and it came back down in numbers, but I mean, as of about 6 months ago, I think it may have still been running in a small way. But, you know, the challenges were just, once the numbers got that huge, now from my end, just producing the music, you know, it didn't really create a challenge. But if you can just imagine, you know, you don't just walk into a post office with 250,000 packages to mail. So it became a really involved operation, and just the check that had to be written to put those in the mail, you know, so managing the dollars and cents did get pretty crazy. But, you know, the end of it that God had me in was just, it was such a faith ride, Travis. I mean, you can imagine, you know, the 8-week thing didn't move. I mean, it didn't budge. We had a ship date. There was no kind of artistic, wow, if I just had another couple of days. You know, it didn't work that way. We had to ship on a day and it had to go. So, you know, we were on our knees, man. You know, it's like, who's the next worship leader going to be? Where are these songs going to come from? And it was out of that desperation that, you know, we just grew so much as believers, man. And just seeing God time after time after time after time be right there on time in a way that just floored us every time. So, you know, that was probably the biggest challenge, is just, you know, who's the next guy going to be? Where are the songs coming from?
Now tell me a little bit about that initial team that got Integrity off the ground, the personalities, the people involved, and maybe even a couple of the first worship leaders that you guys went to.
Yeah, I mean, the first guys were obviously guys that I knew really well. Like the pastor of my church was one, Ron Tucker. He's still a great pastor. The next guy I went to was Kent Henry, the leader on That Cut You Played. Kent is an awesome brother. He was the youth leader at our church there. And some of the early guys, Don Moen was a guy who always came to our church there in St. Louis, and was a good friend. So he was a guy I called on right away. Charlie LeBlanc, another great guy from there in St. Louis, good friend of mine. So a lot of it was our close group, and also close friends, worship leaders of the other brothers. Like Mike Coleman was central. He was the guy that published that New Wine magazine, and he was really the first guy who basically called me up and said, "Hey Tom, can we come and visit you and talk to you about distributing this album?" Garrett Gustafson was another great brother that was back there at that time, still involved in ministry. Another great guy that was in that initial group was a guy named Ed Lindquist, who was a business guy who worked for Toyota actually at the time, and good friend of Mike's. And so Ed brought a lot of the kind of, once we found ourselves in having to deal with the business side of it, Ed brought a lot of real good knowledge too. So it was basically those guys. It was myself and Mike, Garrett, Ed was there, and starting around album number 5, Don was there as well. So really that group of core guys, we would sit in my living room and cry out to God saying, what's the next album going to be, Lord? Wow.
Tell us about that first ever Integrity project. Where and how it was recorded and who all was involved.
Well, that very first one that you played, that's the one where basically the magazine was done, and that was it was actually number 3. If you look at the numbers, the reason it was number 3 is because of those first 2 that we did kind of pre. But the first one we did after the magazine was shut down was that one, and that was recorded at my home church there in St. Louis, Grace World Outreach Center. Kent was the worship leader, and when I was going to college, all of the St. Louis Symphony guys were like the teachers in my college, so I got to know these guys. I was like the student conductor of the symphony chorus there, and the St. Louis Symphony was on a roll, so there were a lot of great players. So I could get these guys to come and do sessions for me because they knew me. And at that point in time, I mean, it's interesting, obviously that sound is like way, kind of orchestral. But at the time, that was sort of like a big deal. It was like a revolutionary thing. So we actually had all these St. Louis Symphony guys there, and it was a pretty epic thing. I listen back to that now and think, I must have arranged that the night after I just came from seeing Star Wars or something. But from a worship standpoint, just the grandeur of I don't know. I mean, to me as an arranger, just that grand scale is kind of the way I envision, just the throne room. When I think of those images, it just sounds orchestral to me. Obviously we're kind of in a period of history now where we're sort of way away from that, and we're back to, which I think is a totally valid thing too, much more of the kind of organic, earthy, here I am with my acoustic guitar kind of era, which again is totally cool too. I mean, I think the sincerity of that is really good for now, because I think once, you got this human nature musical taste thing that's going on too, and our human nature is still alive, so we tend to, I don't know, that tends to get in the way of our worship sometimes. But the thing I like about where we are now is sincerity is always the thing, man. And like sincerity of worship, heartfelt worship, direct connection, that's always going to be the thing. So, if you go too much into the orchestral thing, obviously that has to be thought through. It has to be planned out. So in a way, if you're not careful, that can kind of turn it into more of a production, a presentation, versus a, hey man, I'm sitting down with my acoustic guitar, I want you to grab these lyrics and then forget about me and just connect with God. There's a lot to be said for that too. So, you know, both sides of the musical spectrum were totally important, I think.
Now, as you went along, 8 weeks after 8 weeks doing these recordings, at what point did you realize, oh man, we have a company, we've started something? And what was the heart and soul behind that company? What led to its kind of official founding and, okay, this is what we're going to be? How did that all come about?
I mean, I totally remember the day when we were, you know, all the four of us would meet usually at my house like every 8 weeks, in 4 weeks in the middle of that 8-week cycle. And I distinctly remember the day we were going out to lunch, and Mike looked at me and said, you know, we're going to have to think of a name for this company. I don't know why that snapshot stuck in my mind, but, you know, I know the restaurant we were walking into when he said that. And, yeah, it was just kind of like, you know what? Wow, God has turned this into something. We got to call it something. And we'd been calling it Hosanna for a while. And this was long about album, I don't know, 7 or 8 or 9, something in there. And there was already a company called Hosanna that made blank tape for churches. And there was this kind of thing of, well, is it going to confuse people? Is it going to, you know, that whole thing. But a whole bunch of people already knew us as Hosanna. So, you know, Mike sat down with them and we tried to figure out a way to do it. And, you know, Mike really liked the feeling of integrity, and that had to be the center of everything we did. You know, whatever we did had to have integrity. So we made this agreement with that other company that, so it wouldn't be confused with their Hosanna, it would be Integrity's Hosanna music. And, you know, it's funny how people are. Everybody always stumbled over that name. And different countries you go to, you know, it's Hosanna Integrity, Integrity Hosanna. You know, nobody knows what to call it. They just kind of know what that is. But it got the double name basically because they wanted to avoid confusion with that other blank tape company.
Interesting.
Kind of goofy, but that's just how it happened.
Tell us about the proposed partnership with Maranatha Music and what that may have looked like and why that didn't happen.
Well, you know, Travis, I was telling you this. You know, we've been trying to hook up this Skype thing all day long, and I don't know if you can see this, but I'm sitting in a control room that. Okay, I don't know if you can check this out. This console, you know, this has been my console for like a bazillion years, and like every Integrity album I ever did was in this console in my studio in my house. Wow. And right now, as of about 5 minutes ago, this console is sitting in a huge studio complex that was built by Maranatha Music. And it's like barely a couple of miles from my house in Southern California. But as of today, I just moved my whole studio into this complex that Maranatha built here in Southern California. And in the beginning, I was in St. Louis, right? And we had produced like 5 of the Integrity albums at that point. And Tommy Coombs, who was the leader of Maranatha, was also hiring me to do some work for them. And I was out here working on the vocals for one of the Praise albums. And I really felt like I was totally convinced that, like the night before, literally, God took me out for one of those walks in the night. And I was convinced that this is like the perfect plan of God. These two companies are going to marry, because at that point, you know, Hosanna was nothing. But I'd made this kind of relationship with Maranatha, so I kind of got these guys hooked up, and Maranatha had agreed to basically absorb Hosanna. So they had the Praise albums that were going, and I think I was working on Praise 9 at that point. And the Hosanna thing was going, and we were up to about number 6. And so basically, Maranatha was going to absorb Hosanna, and Hosanna was going to be a parallel line. So you'd have the Praise albums going here, and you'd have the Hosanna albums going here. Praise albums were sort of a tight, clean studio thing. And then what we were doing was much more live, you know, spirit-filled, you know, a little bit more aggressive, kind of out there music.